The neighborhood had always been quiet, a picture-perfect suburban cul-de-sac with neatly trimmed lawns, pastel-colored houses, and a row of cars parked like soldiers along the curb. At first glance, it seemed like the kind of place where nothing out of the ordinary ever happened. But beneath the surface, small conflicts simmered, usually about fences, paint colors, or who left their trash bins out too long. And at the center of these disputes was one particular neighbor, a woman who had earned herself the nickname Karen. Karen was the self-proclaimed guardian of the Homeowners Association rules. Even when she wasn't on the board, she patrolled the streets with a clipboard, documenting every minor infraction she spotted. Whether it was grass growing a little too high, a mailbox slightly crooked, or a car parked a few inches past the curb line, she made it her mission to file complaints. Most people ignored her, rolling their eyes whenever she stormed through the neighborhood with her phone out, snapping pictures like a traffic officer. But while her actions annoyed many, they rarely escalated beyond passive-aggressive letters, slipped into mailboxes, or endless complaints on the neighborhood Facebook group. That changed when she set her sights on cars. Karen had decided that too many vehicles cluttered the otherwise pristine streets, and she began threatening to call towing companies. Her favorite targets were those who parked overnight on the street, even though the rules technically allowed it. She insisted it was an eyesore and that the neighborhood deserved better. Among the many people Karen had her eye on was her next-door neighbor, a young man who worked long hours and often returned home late. His car, a modest but well-kept sedan, would sometimes be parked curbside for convenience. It wasn't in anyone's way, it wasn't blocking driveways, and it certainly wasn't breaking any official HOA rules. But to Karen, it was a crime against the order she demanded. The warnings started with sharp notes stuck under his windshield wipers. Then came the angry posts online, where Karen claimed she was fighting for the integrity of the neighborhood. Soon, she began threatening to involve towing services if he didn't respect the community. Most neighbors brushed it off as yet another one of her crusades, but behind closed doors, whispers spread about just how far Karen might go this time. It was one late evening when Karen's obsession reached a boiling point. Standing at her window, she spotted a car parked in front of her house. The sight made her blood boil. She didn't recognize the vehicle, and she immediately assumed it belonged to the young man she'd been targeting. She pulled out her phone, snapped pictures for evidence, and made a call. To her, it was the final straw. She dialed the local towing company, her voice sharp and commanding, demanding immediate action. She explained that the car was illegally parked, that it was abandoned, and that it needed to be removed at once. The dispatcher, used to these types of calls, agreed to send a truck. Karen stood outside, arms crossed, pacing back and forth as she waited for the tow to arrive. She felt triumphant, convinced that this time she had finally won her battle against the so-called rule breakers of the neighborhood. What Karen failed to realize, however, was that the car she targeted didn't belong to her neighbor. In fact, it didn't even belong to anyone in her immediate circle. The vehicle parked in front of her house that night was a sleek, high-end SUV, polished to perfection, with tinted windows and chrome accents. Its presence should have been enough to make her pause, but in her fury, she saw only what she wanted to see. To her, it was nothing more than a nuisance that needed to be eliminated. When the tow truck finally arrived, its flashing lights illuminated the street. Neighbors peeked out from behind curtains, curious about the commotion. Karen wasted no time, striding confidently toward the driver and gesturing toward the SUV. She pointed with such authority that the man didn't even question her. He simply followed her lead, hooked up the vehicle, and began lifting it onto the flatbed. Karen stood with her hands on her hips, satisfied that justice was being served. The sound of chains rattling and the hum of the tow truck's engine echoed through the quiet night. Slowly, the SUV was pulled away, disappearing into the distance. Karen felt a wave of victory wash over her. She believed she had taught her neighbor a valuable lesson, one that would prove she was not to be ignored. But as the night grew silent once more, a storm was quietly brewing, one that would soon turn her smug triumph into a nightmare. For the SUV she had ordered towed did not belong to her young neighbor at all. It belonged to someone far more influential, someone with the means and determination to hold her accountable for what she had just set in motion. And when the owner discovered what had happened, the fallout would send shockwaves through the entire community. Morning came quietly to the neighborhood, the sunlight creeping across neatly lined houses and dew-speckled lawns. But the peace didn't last long. Just as the first few residents stepped outside with coffee mugs in hand, a sharp voice shattered the stillness. The voice belonged to the SUV's owner, a man who had returned home late the previous night and woken up to discover his prized vehicle missing. The man was not just any neighbor. He was someone well-respected in the community, successful, generous, and known for hosting barbecues that brought people together. His SUV wasn't just a mode of transportation. It was a symbol of his hard work, carefully chosen and meticulously maintained. And now, it was gone. Panic quickly gave way to anger. He immediately contacted the towing company, assuming there must have been some mistake. The conversation he had with the dispatcher was short but revealing. The company confirmed that, yes, a tow had been requested, and the vehicle had been removed from the neighborhood the night before. When he asked who had authorized the call, the answer stunned him. The name Karen was given without hesitation. In that moment, everything clicked into place. His SUV had not been taken because of an error on his part. It had been targeted. And the person responsible was the very same neighbor notorious for her relentless rule-enforcing antics. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood. By mid-morning, nearly everyone knew that Karen had ordered the towing of the wrong vehicle. Gossip traveled from porch to porch, carried by hushed voices and raised eyebrows. Some people were outraged on behalf of the SUV's owner, while others couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity of the situation. The one person who seemed blissfully unaware of the storm she had created was Karen herself. She strutted around, her front yard humming proudly as she watered her flowers, acting as though she had done the entire neighborhood a favor. In her mind, she had finally rid the street of what she thought was her neighbor's unsightly car. She had no idea that her target had been completely innocent, or that the consequences of her actions were about to descend on her like a tidal wave. When the SUV's owner confronted the towing company in person, he managed to retrieve his vehicle, but not without paying a hefty fee. The charges were steep, including towing costs, storage, and administrative expenses. Furious, he demanded to know who would be held accountable. The company pointed back to Karen, explaining that she had been the one to report the vehicle as abandoned and improperly parked. They were simply following her instructions. That was all he needed to hear. He returned home, SUV back in his driveway, and wasted no time in preparing his next move. He wasn't the type to let such blatant overreach slide, especially when it came from someone who had been a nuisance to the community for years. By the afternoon, he had already contacted the Homeowners Association, filing a formal complaint against Karen. He also began exploring legal options, aware that her reckless call had not only cost him money, but had also violated his rights as a homeowner. Meanwhile, other neighbors quietly rejoiced. For years, Karen had been the source of stress, lecturing people about garbage bins, barking about lawn maintenance, and tattling to the HOA about even the smallest deviations from the rules. Now, it seemed she had finally gone too far. Her downfall was beginning, and many were eager to watch how it would unfold. Karen, however, remained in her bubble of self-satisfaction, not realizing that her so-called victory was unraveling. She had not anticipated the backlash, nor did she consider that the person she had wronged wasn't just another neighbor she could intimidate with notes and complaints. This was someone with influence, someone with resources, and someone determined to put an end to her meddling once and for all. As dusk settled over the neighborhood, a quiet tension hung in the air. Windows glowed with the flicker of televisions, but the true entertainment was outside, where whispers of Karen's mistake grew louder with each passing hour. She had tried to enforce her version of order, but in doing so, she had ignited a chain of events that would spiral far beyond her control. The following day would not bring the routine calm she expected. Instead, it would bring confrontation, humiliation, and the first cracks in the carefully crafted image she had built as the neighborhood's self-appointed enforcer. Karen had pulled the wrong trigger, and now the consequences were coming straight for her. By the next morning, the neighborhood was buzzing with anticipation. For years, residents had endured Karen's relentless policing, her endless stream of complaints, and her superiority complex. But now, she had crossed a line. It wasn't just a matter of leaving nasty notes or posting passive-aggressive rants online. This time, she had interfered with someone else's property in a way that had real financial and legal consequences. The SUV's owner wasted no time. He was calm but firm, moving with a quiet determination that sent a ripple of unease through the cul-de-sac. Instead of yelling at Karen or creating a dramatic scene, he took a calculated approach. He documented everything. He had the towing company's paperwork showing her name. He had receipts for the costs he had been forced to pay to get his SUV back. And he had the testimony of the dispatcher who had confirmed that Karen had called, in the order herself. With all of this in hand, he turned to the Homeowners Association. The HOA board had been tired of Karen for a long time. She had been more of a problem than a solution, constantly clogging meetings with petty complaints while alienating nearly every neighbor in the process. The board tolerated her because she was loud. But now, they finally had something tangible to use against her. The complaint filed against her wasn't just a minor slap on the wrist. It was serious. She had abused authority she didn't even have. She had impersonated the HOA when making the tow request, and in doing so, she had caused real damage. That was not only a violation of HOA bylaws, but also a potential legal liability. When the board scheduled an emergency meeting to discuss the incident, word spread like wildfire. Neighbors circled the date on their calendars, eager to attend. For once, the focus wouldn't be on someone's lawn height or mailbox color. It would be on Karen. But Karen herself still lived in denial. She walked her dog with her head held, high, glaring at anyone who dared make eye contact. In her mind, she had done nothing wrong. She believed that calling the tow was simply her enforcing community standards, as she always had. Even when whispers followed her down the street and neighbors chuckled behind their doors, she brushed it off as jealousy. Her confidence only began to waver when she received a letter from the HOA. The language was formal, but the message was clear. She was being summoned to answer for her actions. Karen's usual smugness faltered for the first time as she read the notice. She tried to convince herself it was nothing serious, just a routine scolding, but deep down she felt the walls closing in. The day of the meeting arrived and the community center filled with more residents than anyone had seen in years. People sat in folding chairs, some standing against the walls, all waiting for the drama to unfold. Karen entered late, clutching a folder of paper she had hastily thrown together. Her expression was tight, her lips pressed into a thin line, but her posture screamed defiance. She took her seat at the front, under the gaze of the entire neighborhood. The board members wasted no time. They laid out the evidence, the call logs, the towing receipt, the testimony from the SUV's owner, and even the statements from neighbors who had witnessed the tow truck arrive at Karen's instruction. It was overwhelming. For once, Karen couldn't talk her way out of it. Still, she tried. She insisted the SUV looked suspicious. She claimed she was protecting the neighborhood. She argued that the car had been parked inappropriately. But the board wasn't buying it. Neither were her neighbors. For every excuse she offered, there was proof to the contrary. And with each rebuttal, her authority crumbled further. The HOA announced their decision before the meeting ended. Karen would be fined heavily for her actions. She would be barred from filing complaints for 6 months, a punishment that many residents secretly celebrated as a long-overdue vacation from her constant harassment. And perhaps worst of all for her pride, the board warned that any further incidents could result in legal action and even removal from the HOA altogether. As the verdict sank in, Karen sat frozen in her chair. For the first time in years, she wasn't the one handing out rules. She was the one facing consequences. The murmurs of the crowd behind her grew louder, and though no one openly cheered, the atmosphere carried an unmistakable sense of satisfaction. The self-proclaimed enforcer of the neighborhood had finally been put in her place. When Karen left the meeting that night, her once confident stride was gone. She avoided eye contact, clutching her papers tightly against her chest. Neighbors watched her walk away, some smirking, others shaking their heads. But one thing was certain, she was no longer untouchable. What Karen didn't yet realize, however, was that the humiliation she felt in that meeting was only the beginning. The SUV's owner wasn't done with her. While the HOA had issued its penalties, he was still pursuing legal options. And as the days passed, the pressure on Karen would only intensify. Her obsession with control had finally spun out of control, and the storm was still gathering. The days following the HOA meeting were some of the most uncomfortable Karen had ever experienced in the neighborhood she once ruled with an iron fist. The same sidewalks she had marched down with confidence now felt like corridors of judgment. Neighbors avoided her, some crossing the street to keep their distance, others whispering openly about her downfall. Where she once thrived on attention, she now found herself shrinking from it, unable to escape the stares and smirks that followed her every move. But while the social humiliation was difficult, the real blow was still to come. The SUV's owner wasn't content with the HOA's ruling. To him, the fines and restrictions handed down by the board were a good start, but they didn't erase the financial burden he had suffered. He had receipts, he had documentation, and he had a strong case. His next step was to consult an attorney. The lawyer wasted no time in laying out the possibilities. Karen had not only impersonated authority she didn't have, but had also caused financial damages by initiating a fraudulent tow. That wasn't just a neighborhood squabble anymore. It bordered on illegal action. The owner had every right to pursue reimbursement for the towing costs, storage fees, and additional damages. And if Karen refused, the matter could be taken to small claims court, or worse, escalate into something far larger. When Karen received the letter from the lawyer, her bravado crumbled. The words leapt off the page, phrases like liability, damages, and legal responsibility. For the first time, she realized this wasn't just about her reputation. It was about her money, her property, and potentially even her standing in the community. Panic set in. Her first instinct was to double down. She drafted lengthy emails to the HOA board, filled with excuses and justifications. She insisted she had acted in good faith, that she was protecting the neighborhood from an unfamiliar car, that she was the victim of misunderstanding. But the board had already made their position clear. They were done shielding her from the consequences of her actions. Meanwhile, the gossip among neighbors only grew more vicious. People who had once quietly endured her constant nitpicking now swapped stories freely. One resident recalled the time she complained about a holiday wreath being too large for the front door. Another shared how she had reported a teenager for playing music in his own garage. The list of grievances grew longer, and with every retelling, Karen's reputation sank lower. The once feared enforcer was now the community's cautionary tale. Parents warned their children about becoming another Karen. Jokes circulated on the neighborhood Facebook page, veiled enough to avoid being flagged, but clear enough that everyone knew who they were about. And every time Karen saw a post, she felt the sting of knowing it was about her, but humiliation wasn't her only problem. The financial strain began to gnaw at her. The legal letter had outlined a demand for repayment, and the sum was far from small. Between the fines from the HOA and the looming possibility of court costs, Karen's carefully maintained image of control started to crack. She tried to maintain her routines, watering her flowers and keeping her lawn pristine, but the effort felt hollow. Behind her front door, she was consumed by worry. The SUV's owner, on the other hand, remained calm and steady. He didn't lash out publicly, nor did he engage in the petty theatrics Karen was known for. Instead, he focused on the facts, quietly building his case and letting the process work in his favor. His restraint only made him more respected among neighbors who admired the way he handled the situation with dignity. It was a stark contrast to Karen's frantic attempts at damage control. As the weeks passed, pressure mounted. Karen tried to rally support from her few acquaintances in the neighborhood, but even they kept their distance. No one wanted to be associated with her now that her actions had spiraled into legal trouble. The isolation was crushing, and for someone who had once thrived on power and influence, the loss of control was unbearable. Eventually, the inevitable happened. Karen was formally served with a notice to appear in small claims court. The SUV's owner was seeking full reimbursement, along with additional damages for the stress and inconvenience caused by her actions. It was a decisive step forward, and one that left Karen trembling. The thought of standing in front of a judge, defending herself against the very neighbors she once tried to control, was almost too much for her to bear. But there was no escaping it now. The chain of events she had set in motion with a single phone call to the towing company had grown into something much larger than she could have ever anticipated. Her quest to enforce order had backfired spectacularly, leaving her reputation in ruins, her finances under threat, and her control over the neighborhood completely shattered. As the court date drew near, the neighborhood buzzed with anticipation once again. People whispered about the upcoming showdown, speculating about the outcome and relishing the irony of Karen being the one dragged into accountability. Karen had wanted to be the face of order in the community, but now she was the symbol of chaos, and the next chapter of her downfall would unfold not in the cul-de-sac, but in a courtroom. The morning of the court hearing carried an unusual weight for the neighborhood. Though most residents went about their routines, taking kids to school, heading off to work, walking dogs, there was an undeniable sense of curiosity. People whispered about the outcome, wondering what kind of punishment Karen might face. For years, she had stood as the loudest voice in the community, dictating rules and criticizing others. Now, she was walking into a room where none of her bluster could save her. Karen arrived at the courthouse early, clutching a thick stack of papers. She had spent days preparing her defense, piecing together screenshots of neighborhood rules, pictures of parked cars, and pages of notes written in her cramped handwriting. To her, it was proof that she had acted reasonably. But to anyone else, it looked like a desperate attempt to justify the unjustifiable. The SUV's owner arrived shortly after, calm and composed, carrying only a slim folder of neatly organized documents. He didn't need theatrics. He had evidence. He had the towing company's confirmation, the receipts for the money he had paid, and the HOA's ruling against Karen. His confidence was quiet but unshakable, and it stood in stark contrast to Karen's restless energy. When the hearing began, Karen launched into her explanation. She spoke quickly, her voice rising as she insisted she had acted in the best interest of the neighborhood. She portrayed herself as a protector, someone who had been vigilant against potential threats. She pointed to the SUV, describing it as suspicious and out of place. But the more she spoke, the less convincing she became. The judge's expression remained neutral, while the SUV's owner listened patiently, waiting for his turn. When he presented his side, the contrast was striking. He laid out the facts clearly and concisely. His vehicle had been legally parked. Karen had no authority to order it towed, and her actions had cost him time, stress, and money. He didn't embellish, he didn't exaggerate. He simply allowed the evidence to speak for itself. The judge asked a few pointed questions, cutting through Karen's excuses. Why had she not contacted the HOA before calling the towing company? Why had she not confirmed the identity of the vehicle's owner? Why did she assume authority she did not possess? Each question left her more flustered, her answers unraveling, as quickly as she gave them. By the end of the hearing, the outcome was obvious. The judge ruled in favor of the SUV's owner, ordering Karen to reimburse him for the towing and storage fees, along with additional damages for the unnecessary stress caused. It wasn't just a financial loss, it was a public defeat. Karen stood frozen as the judgment was read. The courtroom was nearly empty, but the weight of humiliation pressed down on her all the same. For once, she wasn't the one writing notes or dictating rules. She was the one being corrected, her actions laid bare under scrutiny. No amount of excuses could soften the blow. When she walked out of the courthouse, the world felt smaller. The papers in her hand no longer felt like evidence. They felt like dead weight. She had spent so long convincing herself that she was right, but now the truth had been carved into stone. She was wrong, and everyone knew it. Back in the neighborhood, news traveled fast. Though not everyone had been in the courtroom, the details spread within hours. The SUV's owner didn't gloat, but others filled in the blanks with relish. Karen had been fined. Karen had lost. Karen had been exposed for what she truly was, an overzealous busybody whose need for control had spiraled into disaster. The judgment hit her hard financially. Between the reimbursement, court fees, and the HOA fines still hanging over her, the costs piled up quickly. For someone who prided herself on keeping appearances, freshly painted shutters, perfectly edged lawn, seasonal decorations that matched to the last detail, money suddenly became tight. Little by little, the cracks began to show. Her flower. Beds went unweeded. Her once perfect lawn developed patches of yellow. Decorations that had once been swapped out with the seasons lingered past their time, a reminder that her grip on control was slipping. Neighbors noticed, of course, and some whispered that it was poetic justice. But the greatest loss for Karen wasn't the money or even the reputation. It was the power. For years, she had ruled the cul-de-sac with an iron will, forcing others to bend to her standards. Now, her authority was gone. People ignored her when she tried to lecture them. They laughed when she attempted to post on the neighborhood Facebook group. She had been reduced from enforcer to outcast, and the sting of that fall was something she couldn't escape. Yet even as her world unraveled, a part of Karen refused to let go. She still believed she had been right. She still saw herself as The victim, unfairly punished for doing what no one else had the courage to do. And in the privacy of her home, behind drawn blinds, she plotted ways to regain control. The neighborhood thought they had seen the last of her meddling, but Karen wasn't finished. Not yet. Her pride wouldn't let her fade quietly into obscurity. If anything, the humiliation only fueled her determination to strike back, even if it meant digging herself into an even deeper hole. The storm of judgment had passed, but the aftershocks were still coming. In the weeks following the courtroom defeat, Karen's presence in the neighborhood shifted from dominant to desperate. The woman who once strutted across driveways with a clipboard now moved cautiously, glancing over her shoulder as if expecting whispers to follow her. And they did. Everywhere she went, she felt the weight of her neighbors' stares. She could no longer tell whether they were mocking her, pitying her, or simply waiting for her next mistake. But Karen was not the type to retreat quietly. The humiliation had cut her deeply, and her pride refused to accept defeat. She convinced herself that if she could reclaim just one victory, one small shred of authority, she could rebuild her reputation. In her mind, she wasn't a meddler. She was a misunderstood guardian of the community, and so she hatched a plan. Her idea was simple but reckless. She would prove, once and for all, that she had been right about enforcing the rules. Late at the night, she began walking the streets again, clipboard in hand, jotting down supposed infractions. Trash bins left out past pickup day, basketball hoops at the edge of driveways, garden decorations she claimed violated HOA guidelines. Every minor detail was noted. She began bombarding the HOA with complaint emails, sometimes sending several in a single day. But the board had already grown tired of her antics. After the towing debacle, they had made it clear that her constant interference was no longer welcome. At first, they ignored her messages, then they sent a formal warning. Still, Karen persisted, convinced that the community would collapse without her vigilance. Her breaking point came one weekend when she spotted a moving truck parked in front of a house down the street. A new family was unloading furniture, their children playing in the yard. Instead of offering a welcome, Karen saw only violations. The truck blocking part of the curb, a temporary basketball hoop set up for the kids, and boxes stacked neatly on the lawn. Fueled by indignation, she snapped photos and once again called the towing company, this time trying to have the moving truck removed. But things didn't go her way. The towing company, already wary after the last fiasco, refused to act without HOA authorization. Frustrated, Karen marched down the street to confront the newcomers directly, waving her clipboard and spewing rules they had never even heard of. What she hadn't counted on was the entire neighborhood watching. Neighbors emerged from their homes, phones in hand, recording as Karen unleashed her tirade. The new family looked bewildered, caught in the crossfire of her obsession. Within minutes, the videos spread through the neighborhood Facebook group, then beyond. Comments poured in, mocking her behavior, labeling her the very thing she had tried so hard not to be. The textbook Karen, the HOA board acted swiftly. At an emergency meeting, they voted to remove her from the association entirely, citing repeated harassment, unauthorized actions, and disruption of community peace. The ruling was final. She could remain a resident, but she would have no influence, no authority, and no voice in neighborhood affairs. For Karen, it was the ultimate humiliation. Her crusade for control had ended with her stripped of the very platform she had built her identity around. The power she once wielded was gone, replaced with the cold reality of isolation. Even her closest acquaintances kept their distance, unwilling to be dragged into her mess. The SUV's owner, meanwhile, thrived. His calm, measured response throughout the ordeal had earned him admiration, and he became something of a quiet leader in the community. Where Karen sowed division, he fostered unity. Where she imposed rules, he encouraged cooperation. The contrast couldn't have been sharper. As months passed, the neighborhood settled back into its peaceful rhythm. Children played in driveways, without fear of complaints. Families decorated their yards freely. Residents felt a newfound sense of relief, as if a storm had finally passed. And though Karen still lived among them, she was no longer a force to be reckoned with, just a reminder of what happens when obsession with control goes too far. In the end, Karen's downfall was entirely of her own making. What began as a misguided attempt to enforce order spiraled into a chain of mistakes, humiliations, and consequences she could never escape. She had tried to tow a car she thought was a problem, but in reality, she had towed away her own reputation, her influence, and her place in the community. Her name became a cautionary tale, a whispered warning at barbecues and neighborhood gatherings. Don't be another Karen.